Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second event of the Race and Place Learning from the Past, Looking to the Future series. Today's guest, LaToya Gray-Sparks, will tell us how digital technology can be used to unveil histories and physical landscapes. My name is Jerica Logan. I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Click on the bottom and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation. And if we do not get to your question, we do apologize. If you have any additional questions following this event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for 1 AICP-CM credit. To claim your credits, please log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter in the event log into your CM event log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of this webinar. If you have time, please provide your feedback. I am now going to pass it over to Harvey Miller, our director.
Okay, thank you so much, Jerica, and welcome everyone to the latest in our Race and Place summer webinar series. I'm here with Josh Savarde, who's the geospatial librarian at The Ohio State University, and the University Library's Research Commons is a co-sponsor of this series. This program is part of CURA's regular series on issues and challenges facing the cities and regions in Ohio and beyond. Our Race and Place series highlights some of the work being done by academic researchers and community activists who have shined new light on past discriminatory practices such as redlining, restrictive covenants, residential displacement, exclusionary zoning, and biased redistricting, and the way these practices contribute to present-day urban inequalities. The Race and Place series features community-engaged scholars and practitioners who are uncovering the legacies of these discriminatory practices and seeking a more socially just future for the people and places that have been harmed. So I have the pleasure today. Before I introduce our guest, I should remind you that we have another event coming up in July. This will be July 21st at noon, and it'll be a talk on the racial and economic foundations of municipal redistricting with Robert Vargas. That'll be July 21st at noon. Please visit cura.osu.edu/events to learn about this and other future events. You can sign up for our newsletter at cura.osu.edu. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And this way, you'll never miss any of the exciting events that are happening at your friendly neighborhood Center for Urban Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. So now I have the pleasure of introducing LaToya Gray-Sparks. She has a master's degree in urban regional planning from the Wilder School at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research interests include urban history, historic preservation, housing policy, and geographic information systems. Also on her webpage, she describes herself as a counter-cartographer, a label I really love. And in 2020, yes, LaToya received international recognition for her story map titled Planned Destruction, which outlines the history of urban planning on Black residents in Richmond, Virginia. And I believe Josh will put that in the chat so you can check out that really wonderful story map. LaToya serves as a board member of the North American Cartographic Information Society, or NACIS. She is also interning as an assistant historian at the Virginia Department of Historical Resources, where she works on projects that would increase the number of Black historic landmarks recognized in the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. So now I'm going to turn it over to LaToya to tell us about landscapes of erasures. Please, LaToya, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Harvey, for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Hi, I'm LaToya Gray-Sparks, and as mentioned, I was raised and I currently live in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. I am a recent graduate of the Wilder School of Governments at VCU, where I studied urban and regional planning And a lot of my focus and concentration has been on urban history and cultural and historic preservation. So I am very grateful to be here today to be speaking to you about landscapes of erasure. Okay, so I think that we all have an origin story. My venture into cartography and historic preservation is rooted in this map and the comments in this map. This is a redlining map of Richmond, Virginia, or rather a homeowners loan corporation map, so HOLC map, but a lot of people call it redlining, the redlining maps. You may have learned this if you paid attention to previous webinars in this series, but these maps were used during the early 20th century by real estate professionals and lenders to determine the value of land. Blue and green meant high value neighborhoods worthy of mortgage loans. Yellow and red indicated low value and blighted neighborhoods. These maps were highly racialized. So red is essentially where Black people lived, and the higher graded properties and parcels were where white people lived. I can recall being introduced to this map and some of its hateful comments when sitting in a room at a university. On that day, I was the only person in color in the room, and I remember hearing the comments on this slide being read aloud. This area is yellow, largely because the school for white children is in the Negro area, D8, and because the Negroes of D8 pass back and forth for access to the William Byrd Park, which lies to the west. For this reason, losses on properties are being taken, southeastern cheap bungalows. When I heard those comments read aloud, I thought that I wanted to just melt in my seat and disappear. And it's mainly because I was very familiar with that area. I knew the maps that those comments were referring to, and I knew the people that those comments were referring to. My family lived in that area. What I was not as certain about was the school that was mentioned in the comments, and that would lead to later research. And I just recently, or not recently, but about a year or so ago, I realized that the school that was being referred to was the former John B. Carey Elementary School, which was an all-white school in Richmond, Virginia. It would later become an all-Black school during the 1950s through 70s, and it was then called the Weston Elementary School, and that's where my dad attended school. So as I stated before, the redlining maps were very highly racialized. The map that I'm showing you right now is a combination of a redlining map on top of a map that was featured in a survey conducted by Harlan Bartholomew. Harlan Bartholomew was one of the first planners, comprehensive planners, to do extensive work across the country. The city of Richmond hired him in the 1930s to begin doing survey work with those efforts culminating or resulting in a comprehensive plan for the city of Richmond. A lot of those surveys included maps, including the one that's on the screen at the moment. This is where all the location of Negro areas were during the 1930s. So those are marked in Black. And just if you take an overlay of a redlining map, you can see how the red lines really match up with where Black people lived within the city. So back to those comments. Again, when I heard those clarifying remarks, they struck a chord in me. And as I mentioned, I wanted to disappear. The people featured in this picture are some of the people who would have been living in that area during that time. You can see my great-grandparents, Ida and Simon Bauer, my aunt Enid, my uncle Walker, who is like this historian of my family and who's provided me with a lot of primary sources that have helped with my research. I'm the little girl with the doll in her hand, in her arm. And this is on the same block as, yes, where that this map is referring to. And this is the apartment that my great-grandparents lived in and that I had always known as their home when I was a little girl. But as I said before, I found those comments so offensive and so infuriating that I decided that I didn't want these comments nor this map to be the only narrative representing a place that I grew up in, as well as people that I loved and who shaped me into the person that I am today. So I'm not usually someone who embraces technology, but I decided I was going to learn GIS. So I enrolled in a few classes to learn how to make my own maps, and the rest is history. And that's why I am talking to you all today. This picture is from the same block. This is 2210 Idlewood Avenue in the 1960s. Again, this is in the Randolph neighborhood and would have been in a red line area on the redlining map. It is in the West End near Bird Park, and I spent a great deal of my childhood in this area without fully knowing its history. To the left is a picture of the home that my great-grandparents Bauer lived in. This is not the home that they were in the previous picture. This is a different place. The dapper man in the black is my grandpa, Robert Gray, may he rest in peace. I think that's where I get a lot of my feistiness from. And the little boys in the picture are my Uncle Marcus in the red and my dad in the gray suit. My grandpa rarely dressed up for holidays or for anything. So I'm thinking that this must have been like Easter Sunday or something, and they were in their best dress and ready to go to church. I had no idea that this place existed until my Uncle Walker shared this picture with me on my birthday just a few years ago. So remember, this is in the 1960s. This is that same location today. It is vacant, underutilized. Occasionally it is used as like a parking lot. And there is no evidence at all of my relatives living in this space. It was physically erased. So my great-grandparents would have lived in this area, and their property was declared to be blighted, and then a part of a slum clearance program. They were initially told that this area would be repurposed into a playground for a nearby school. That never happened. And so they were pushed into public housing right across the street from where their home used to exist. So for the last days of my great-grandparents' lives, like, they would be able to see this vacant lot and just, I mean, it's a realistic reminder, or just a reminder of the value of their space, of their property, of their lives. And unfortunately, you can see kind of like these fragmented landscapes or erased landscapes throughout the city, which I think often begs like a bigger question of what used to be there and who used to live in these spaces. So I guess the revelation of that, just receiving that picture from my uncle, like, just really started, I guess, generating a lot of questions that I had. Like, I wanted to know more about this neighborhood or this landscape that I grew up in, that I thought, and I hate to say this, but when I was visiting my great-grandparents, it would have been like early in the 90s, 2000s and whatnot. And my dad would often speak of this neighborhood that he remembered as like intact and thriving and just having all of this energy and community. And I didn't always see that. It was a fraction of the neighborhood that he grew up in. And a lot of that was because of planned destruction and displacement and dispossession. And so that launched me into just this journey of wanting to research Black neighborhoods in Richmond and try to reimagine them and or just provide some kind of visualizations of what used to exist, and also proof to show what has been taken away unfairly. So some of the techniques that I use when investigating landscapes of erasure include consulting community members who live in the area. That would be my uncle. He's been very instrumental, and my dad as well. They've given me so many leads to look up when doing my research. Conducting archival research for social histories. I use primary sources like phone directories, census records, newspaper articles, old maps. I love a good Sanborn map, which I have featured on this slide. But those can often be used to show the historical topography of a space before it was disrupted. I can't emphasize enough how helpful old planning documents have been. I showed that map from Harlan Bartholomew's plan, his plan that was implemented and accepted and implemented by the city in the 1940s, really set the foundation for future planning in the city. I don't think I mentioned this, but I served on the advisory council for Richmond 300, which created the comprehensive plan for the city of Richmond that we are using now. It was a 3-year engagement that was very eye-opening to me, who hadn't had any experience in urban planning. But I found that a lot of the disparities and inequalities that we were trying to address were rooted in a plan that was issued in the 1930s. So we were still operating kind of like within the framework set during the times of Jim Crow and white supremacy. So planning documents, I think, can be very instrumental into providing, because all these surveys are done, so you get an idea of what the demographics look like, where populations resided within a city, schools that was often they served as a centerpiece of neighborhoods. So I was able to trace like where the white schools were in Richmond, where the Black schools were, which ones eventually would be turned into, like if it was all white, then converted into an all Black school. But just there's a wealth of information in those documents. They look so boring and technical at times, but I highly recommend checking those out because they can be very helpful and exploring the history of a space. And as a historic preservationist, I would also recommend looking at surveys conducted by historic preservationists. I am learning and finding that during the 1950s, 60s, no, actually in the 40s, there was like a big survey done in Richmond documenting all of the historic landmarks within the city. And there is a plan that I came across recently that Ohio State University provided digitally. Thank you so much. But it was a transportation plan done in the 1950s for the city of Richmond. And they made an explicit remark about how there was this historic survey that should guide transportation planning in Richmond, and that any places or landmarks that were marked as historic should not be disturbed, meaning the monuments on Monument Avenue, which are no longer on our physical landscape, but those were protected landmarks within the city and would help to shape or create these landscapes of erasure that I'm addressing now. So I include on this slide, I hate to be so long-winded, but like there's a Sanborn map at the top. I think that those are very awesome. This at the bottom is a snippet from a phone directory from the city of Richmond. I think phone directories can be very helpful as well as providing information about people. Like I highlighted my my great-grandparents. You can see where my grandpa was employed, Reynolds Metals, where he worked. And so I think that those can be very helpful as well. So in my archival research, I came across many articles, a lot, and they can be infuriating. And these are just 3 examples from the same year. The one in the middle is I think it's a condemnation notice, but through these articles, I was able to pick up the times in which I guess our housing authority was given a lot of power to acquire properties through the use of eminent domain. So condemning properties and then compelling people to show up before court, either maybe to pay back taxes, and if they didn't have that, then their properties were condemned, and or just to give them notice that their properties were up for grabs and they would be taken away from them. The second ad from March 1956 is a demolition ad. There are plenty of those also that I've noticed in my research, in which private contractors were hired to demolish neighborhoods like at a large scale. And this article to the left is very infuriating because if you read, like the devil is in the details, and this is a very small article, but within it, there are like 4 different projects happening at the same time, all displacement, slum clearance projects. There's a promise of 894 units if they constructed that, and that didn't always pan out to be the case. But it also talks about the 1,700 families to be displaced by all of these projects. And I think what galls me, and there will be housing provided for some of those families. So one, we know that 1,700 households were impacted, but that doesn't necessarily outline the number of individuals impacted directly. And then the thought of 894 houses or units being proposed does not match the number of people being displaced. So that, to me, raises questions of like, where did these people go? Where were they during the time of construction? So I guess just through my own research, I just noticed like these local diasporas, like these forced displacements of people, Black people throughout the city. And my own family experienced that a few times. These are examples of some of the archive pictures that I've been able to find. I'm realizing that I'm very fortunate. We have the Library of Virginia that's been wonderful as far as digitizing as much of its records as possible, which have provided images and maps that have been very helpful for my research. And we also have the Valentine Museum, which is like the city's historic institution in some ways, but they have all of these awesome images that were taken. And some of these are from the Edith Shelton collection. And she was a photographer who went to places that most people probably would not go to, you know, places where my family lived, and she took pictures. And what I love is that she captured the humanity. She wasn't just focusing on buildings, she focused often on the people existing in those spaces. And so that's been very helpful. And so some of these images, so most of these, well, 3 of these images represent places that no longer exist. The pool still exists. I included that because I just think it's a nifty picture. At the top, this one was actually provided by my Uncle Walker. That is him, my Uncle Gerald, the little kid, and my Aunt Lareith at their first house on Idlewood Avenue. They lived at the 1900 block of Idlewood. And when the expressway was being built in the 1950s, they were displaced. But I want you all to look at this because you have the nice picket fence, you have that awning in the back, just like what looks like a really nice dwelling, like not blighted at all. And so sadly, my great-grandparents would be displaced from this location in the 1950s, thinking that they were safe. They just moved further west on Idlewood. And once more, their home was up for grabs in the late 1960s, which I've demonstrated. This church no longer exists. It's Osgood Memorial Church. It's another casualty of urban renewal. My great-grandpa Gray was a deacon at this church. So that was interesting. It was just nice for me to come across this image. And this structure at the bottom, I'm going to dig into a little bit more just to, I guess, provide examples of how I've conducted my work. So this house is freaking amazing. If you compare it to houses that you see on Monument Avenue is a historic neighborhood. Like it could give them a run, those homes a run for their money. No offense to anyone who lives on Monument Avenue, but I think the structure is fantastic. And so what I have on this slide are survey notes that I found just, gosh, I want to say like maybe a year and a half ago. I didn't necessarily have this picture just yet. I also found this through the Valentine Museum's digital collection. So someone is working very hard to get these updated, and I'm so thankful for that work. But initially, all I had were these descriptions of this Victorian Queen Anne house that existed on Idlewood Avenue, dating back to 1890. And it was demolished, but it dates back to Reconstruction and Growth, which is, you know, a very historic period of time. And if you look, and so unfortunately there aren't, there's not a lot of in the description because I'm guessing it was just a quick survey. But I think what made my heart sink was reading the last line. This building was 2 stories, wood frame with weatherboarding, restored to excellent condition prior to demolition. This structure was demolished in the 1970s. So Richmond had already gone through a few massive displacements at this point. First, the Jackson Ward downtown area, which was awful and very destructive, but that was with the construction of the expressway through downtown Richmond and obliterating a Black neighborhood. But that was in the 1950s. And there were other displacement projects that happened along the way. And then unfortunately, people in the West End and Fulton would experience this as well in the 1970s. But look at this structure. And so when I finally came across this picture, I felt like, oh my gosh, I have to find out more about this because this is freaking amazing and what a loss and what a travesty. This is another picture of that location. This is from the 1940s. This operated as, and this is the 1400 block of Idlewood Avenue. And look at that. Look at all of those beautiful homes, very historic. Like if you're a historic architect, I mean, you're like, this is like, it doesn't get better than this. But so this operated as a funeral home, but also a dwelling. I think it's affiliated with a family with the last name of Binga. I know that according to census records, there was a Grace Binga who owned this home, but it also served as a funeral home as well. And it was definitely an anchor for the community at that time. The picture today on the right is what it looks like now. I mean, not bad structures at all, but I mean, gosh darn, like, I mean, for a city that really prides itself on historic structures, like I just, yeah, I have no words. And also I have to give a shout out to my mentor, Dr. Lisa Wynn Bryan. She's been very helpful as far as walking with me through the Randolph and Black West End, just to catalog like spaces of where erasure has taken place. And we had to do a double take a few times looking at this old picture and then looking at what exists today. The Housing Authority, I think, acquired this property in the 1970s. I think it sat vacant and underutilized for quite some time. It would be eventually sold to, I think, a private developer. And so you have these structures today, but still like what a loss. And yeah, just an example of erasure that's happened throughout the city. So some of the ways in which I've tried to integrate my work and make it more accessible to people is through technology. I'm a big fan of story maps. So I've started working on one for the Black West End. It will be an integration of all of the pictures, maps, other documentation that I found that will hopefully help to provide a record for community in a neighborhood that I think has been understudied at this point and not documented as well as it should be. Within this story map, I have a virtual tour that I've created. And through this virtual tour, I integrate both structures that still exist within Randolph, because there's like a church that dates back to the 1800s that the Black Randolph community centered around that still exists today. And I believe that it should be registered as a historic landmark. So I will be working on that. But within my virtual tour, I try to integrate buildings that exist today, as well as those that don't, to help make a case for a cultural district, or I'm losing my words at the moment, but often historic preservationists will focus on buildings and structures and what actually still exists. And they have a standard called the integrity standard, which means how much does a structure like look or compare to the original structure. And that applies to landscapes as well. Like how many homes are still intact that can represent like this historic architectural style. And that is often something that's not fair to people whose homes and neighborhoods were purposefully deconstructed or destroyed. We have a lot of instances now of Black community or Black organizations seeking a historic designation for their neighborhood. And sadly, there are often fragments of what used to exist, and that's used against them. And so I am working to try to stop that. And I've also started using other software such as Miro. Okay, and the platform, I just saw a question. I thought that was like the 30-minute mark, but the platform that I use to create my story map is through Esri, ArcGIS Online, and I can share more about that later. And then I started creating this community family map. So it looks like a family tree I created it through Miro because it's like a big whiteboard and I can move stuff around. It's just easier to manipulate. But my goal is to, like, through the use of census data, just map each and every family that lived in the West End and the people who lived within these buildings and structures, to start to provide a name and faces and whatnot to the numbers that we see of people who've been displaced. And this is a map that I'm working on. It's a little rough. It's a work in progress. I envy my fellow cartographers who are able to, like, make maps on their own. So this is my attempt. And like I said, it's a work in progress. But again, like, outlining and visualizing the people who lived in these homes so that they're no longer data points, but people who are worthy and deserving of recognition. And so I think that I've reached my time limit. So just some takeaways that I have, like, when you're engaging in this work, I strongly urge people who work in built environments to learn from the past and to apply that to the present. Look for patterns, systems, and processes that are perpetuating injustices and inequality, and try not to replicate that if you can. Also, be careful of how you describe or characterize spaces. If a place is blighted or vacant, it's highly likely that there's more to that space than meets the eye. And always, always center people over places and structures. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, LaToya, for that really illuminating talk. This seems like a really big project, and a lot of effort goes into this. And maybe that's where I'll start some of my questions. And before I get into my questions, I want to encourage the audience to put questions into the chat, and we can get to them a little bit later on during this Q&A period. But I understand the need to center people over places and structures and do this archival research, but tell us the challenges in doing that archival research. It seems to be very labor intensive, requires a lot of discovery. Can you tell me the big challenges that you face trying to do this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess we were talking briefly about archival research and how hard it is. And I think for me, yeah, I guess I was surprised. I've done work before on the Jackson Ward community, and there's just a lot of information available about that community. And maybe because of the economic ties that it had, and that there were some very remarkable and awesome and amazing luminaries affiliated with that landscape. So I was really disappointed when digging into research on this neighborhood that I grew up in and not finding as much. And I'm reminded of how Black people were often not included in the more formal ways of record keeping and documentation. So that has certainly been hard. It's been like trying to put together pieces of a puzzle and you don't even realize what pieces are missing. So that has definitely been a challenge, and it is very labor intensive. And I think, but for some of the elders that I've communicated with, I would not be as far as I am. Like they've been the ones who helped to, like, generate, like, questions and new avenues to look into or rabbit holes to go down. But it's been very challenging in that way.
What is your process for doing this? It sounds like talking to community elders is very important in discovering some of this archival record, but maybe you can tell us, like, how you go about it, or is it just a matter of, like, feeling your way through the records and then going where they lead you?
Yeah, I wish I was more structured, and I should be. It would save me a lot of heartache. I go sometimes wherever the flow takes me. Like, I guess, yeah, I'll get an idea, like someone will post something on Twitter. I'm like, oh, let me look that up. And then it leads to a rabbit hole. But when I'm trying to be more structured, I have found, so as a graduate student, or now former graduate student, I really took advantage of the access to old newspaper archives that is maybe harder to get, like if you're a member of the public. So I've used, like, the database through VCU to go to research, like, Richmond Times Dispatch, which is Richmond's main paper. And just, I'll type in some words, like, in its database, and I'll just start looking or sifting through those articles. I would structured and organized process. There are people who probably know more about this than I do, or are better at it. Yeah, and in, like, for urban renewal and demolition, I would look up demolition, or our housing authority, which was very much involved in the demolishing and slum clearance programs. And so that's where I'd start and just start reading articles and documenting and trying to keep them in some kind of organized fashion as far as a timeline is concerned.
Hmm. And are most of these records in digital form, or do you have to actually seek out the paper records and try to digitize them yourself?
See, this is why I love technology, and I love just the efforts that are taking place. That librarians are freaking awesome. I guess there's been this movement to make more documents like this accessible, because I will tell you, I was using microfiche a few years ago, and I'm like, I ain't got time for that. I got to find something else to research. But then thankfully, I just found all of these documents now digitized that were easier to search and save. But oh my word, I don't know how people did it with microfiche. It's so hard, but I'm just so thankful that we have institutions that are working really hard to make this data and information more accessibly available to people.
Right. That's been a big boon. I know in some of our research in Columbus, if it weren't for like digitized Sanborn atlases or realtor multiple listing cards that go back to the 50s, we're discovering things that otherwise we would not be able to access. So yes, I'm a big fan of technology too, and librarians. But so someone asked about the story map. I was wondering, I know you use Esri for that, but I was wondering if you can describe for the audience who may not be familiar with this concept, what is a story map and why do you think it's so popular?
Yeah, so story maps, and I mentioned, or you mentioned that I am a counter cartographer. And so that counter cartography and counter mapping is kind of disrupting mapping and geography, or just providing different narratives that aren't necessarily from like a Eurocentric lens. And so I have found within counter cartography that a lot of like indigenous communities have been using story maps, and it's an integration of maps, so geography, but also you can insert audio, like so oral histories can be inserted into this platform, and it's very easy to use. Like if people are familiar with WordPress, I would describe it as that way, but just a little bit more, it's definitely geography focused. So, but story maps are ways that communities that have been marginalized have been able to provide their own stories and narratives from like a different lens. So I'm a huge fan of this platform, and I highly recommend it. And if I can learn it, anyone can, trust me. So,
So you also mentioned towards the end, you should learn from the past and apply it to the present. I'm wondering what the various reactions to this research has been locally, not only among the people who were displaced and the people still live in these communities, but like among the city government, city leaders. I mean, has it been varied, or just tell us a little bit about that.
I think that there's a great appreciation for the work that I'm doing. For the most part, I've gotten like a lot of positive feedback, and people have been pretty receptive. There was an article that was published earlier this year where someone like made death threats, like just about my work. And I was just mapping like the people and places that existed in downtown Richmond, and that someone was not happy about that, and they had to be reported to like the authorities. So that's like the only instance that I've seen so far of someone not having a good reaction to my work. And so thankfully that's been it. And it hasn't been that serious in my opinion, but I think people appreciate just having their eyes open to maybe a history or narratives that they're not interested in, but they've just not known about. But I think the biggest pleasure that I get out of this is like when people who've experienced this displacement and dispossession, like when they're looking at my map and looking like to see if they can find their family's names on my map, and or they have a neighborhood or a space that they want me to look into, or they have these memories that are just nostalgic of just what their community looked like beforehand. And just a lot of pain, of course, is affiliated with the displacement and dispossession, but then also a lot of wonderful memories of like community as it was. So I guess that's what I try to focus on when I'm sharing my work. Like those are the people that I'm doing this work for. So, yeah.
And what actions would you like to see in the real world based on your research in terms of going forward in Richmond to have a more just community?
So we are in the throes of there's a lot of changes happening that are exciting in Richmond. There's a lot of development. There are a lot of people who are now attracted to Richmond because it's a great place to be. But what I fear or worry about is that we are in some ways replicating the mistakes of the past. And so my preference is that people who have been displaced or mistreated and are marginalized through urban planning and redevelopment need to be centered in all of the planning that's going on in the city. We have a proposal for the downtown Richmond area in which we have engaged with consultants and other developers from outside of the city to decide how to develop downtown Richmond, but not necessarily centering the people who are displaced to begin with, many of whom still live in the city. And, I just want their voices to be centered more in the discussions as we move forward. And there are people in other parts of the city who are now fearing being displaced once more. Like they can remember being moved out of downtown Richmond during the 1960s. They moved over to the South Side, and now the South Side, which has been like a place of a lot of affordable housing and units, is now targeted by speculative real estate developers and investors. And so I try to remind people like, hey, we should not be repeating the mistakes of the past. And so, I guess that audience is what I'm thinking of as well when I do my work. We can learn, we know better, and so we should definitely be doing better.
Yeah, I was going to ask about issues surrounding gentrification and displacement in Richmond. We had this period in the mid to late 20th century where just entire neighborhoods were just erased, as you're saying. Mm-hmm. But we're still seeing new types of displacement by speculative, investment into housing, and also, people moving back into city centers. Has that been an issue, and how is your research helping to kind of inform that process and highlight it?
Yes, so that has been an issue and then some. One thing I noticed when looking at the statistics of the population in Richmond, our population has increased by 10% total population in Richmond, but at the same time, over the past 10 years, the Black population has declined or decreased by 11%. So there has been displacement that's taken place already. And I think what is infuriating as someone who's definitely more community focused is that people have been trying to sound the alarm about this for years. And unfortunately, the data, like the census data, was not necessarily reflecting the lived experiences of people. And now it's caught up, but it's too late for those who've been displaced. So the way in which my work hopefully helps is just highlighting patterns or processes that occurred in the past that are happening today, that if we are wise and observant, like maybe we can stop it before it gets worse. And that includes the speculative real estate shenanigans that are happening right now. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Josh Savardi, who's going to handle some of the questions we've received from the audience. Josh, please.
Yeah, thanks, Harvey. And thank you, LaToya, so much for doing this work and for this great presentation today. We have a number of really good questions. And I'm going to start with one that you sort of recently touched on, because I think that you answered it to a certain extent so far. I want to give you a chance to maybe elaborate further. But there's one person that says, great presentation. What's your long-term goal for the research? Is it to show America's history, use the information to get land back that was taken away from Black people? What's your action plan in terms of sort of operationalizing this history? And I think you touched on that a lot, but I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on any of the stakeholders maybe that you're working with, or other things on the horizon.
Yes, so I think I have some potential stakeholders I'll be working with. I haven't had a chance to touch base with them yet, but I think for me, When I started this research, like one, I found that like, oh my gosh, these are stories that really need to be amplified and told. And people have confirmed that. But I think there's a broader goal that I have, and people hate to hear it, but I guess I'll call it restitution. I think there needs to be some kind of accountability for the people who have been deprived of so much. There's a documentary called Raised that's about that was created by an amazing team, but it's about urban renewal that occurred in Charlottesville and how an entire Black community was wiped out, Vinegar Hill. And some of the reoccurring themes from that is that, you know, people had to start all over again. So there were opportunities for white people and affluent people in this city to accumulate wealth. You know, if you look at the value of Monument Avenue, which has benefited from racial covenants and all kinds of white supremacist processes and systems, and that block is doing pretty well. But then you look at the block that like my relatives lived on, and not so much. And I think that there's some atoning that needs to be done. Now, what that looks like, I don't know. I mean, I know what I would like, but I'm not going to be the speaker for everyone. But I think that there needs to be some kind of restitution, a recognition, and some kind of atonement. That's what I can say at the moment. But thankfully, I'm in conversations with other people who feel the same way. And I think that my research can certainly help with making a case for that.
Yeah, thank you. Before I ask you another question, I just want to take a second and say that there's a comment from someone who is a fellow alum of your grad school program and has some connections, it looks like, to your family and the area, the Jackson Ward neighborhood. So I'm going to leave that in there, and I'll give you a chance to take a look at that as well. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
So the next question is, I think, a really interesting one. So it says, many of us do community outreach as part of planning departments. What is your advice on how to address the distrust of planning that is understandably present in many of those communities?
Oh my gosh. And I think I meant to bring her up earlier in my conversation. So Dr. Andrea Roberts, she is a professor at the University of Virginia. She's also, she's really big into historic preservation. She's amazing. You should check out her project, the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which documents and maps all of these free settlements that Black people settled in throughout Texas. And her work inspires mine. But she is very big on community outreach and lifting and amplifying the elders and communities. So I know that community engagement is a part of a planning process. Like, that is, you have to do it, but just be intentional about the way in which you do it, and also listen to people. I think that's a complaint that I'm hearing from people here in Richmond, is that they go through these processes, they make their voices heard, but then they don't necessarily see that being honored or reflected in the plans that come out of those engagements. So I would say, please, if you're going to do community engagement, be sincere and intentional about it. Listen to people. I have found that people may not have the technical language or jargon that preservationists and planners have, but they have an idea of what is right or what they want for their community, particularly in marginalized communities. So I think really amplifying those voices is critical. And I think that can also contribute to reparative and restorative planning, like amplifying those voices and finding ways to support them. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, this next question is an interesting one, maybe about how your work could translate into other areas. So we have someone who says, as a current graduate student in Ohio State's social work field, how can I apply your research when working with similar communities impacted by disenfranchisement? And I just want to tack onto that. As you carried out your work, did you engage with social workers or others in other fields to help you kind of uncover some of these stories or engage with the folks in these neighborhoods?
Gosh darn. So That's a great question. I actually will be giving a tour next week to some students from, I believe, the Department of Social Work at VCU. I'll be giving them a virtual, I'll be guiding them through Randolph. So I wish that I had thought about that sooner, like as far as reaching outside of my urban planning sphere to work with people who are interacting and interfacing on a regular basis with people in these communities. I think that, and I love the social work community that we have at VCU because they're very intentional. They have a very equity lens that they apply to everything. And had I known that sooner, I certainly would have engaged with them earlier. But I think that just maybe knowing the history of the spaces that you are working in helps. Destruction, displacement, here in Richmond, I know a lot of Black people were lumped or placed into public housing. So they were concentrated or pushed into certain geographies within the city that were cut off from services and other vital, resources that other communities throughout the city have. So I think understanding that historical knowledge can help a great deal when you're in your approach when engaging with underrepresented or marginalized communities.
We have a bit of time left, so I'll just welcome the audience again to please feel free to put additional questions in the Q&A. In the meantime, there are a couple more that are maybe a little bit more focused on your methods and the technologies that you've used. And so we have a guest who's asked, what platform and keywords did you use in your historical newspaper research? So I know you mentioned some of the keywords you were using. I don't know if you mentioned the specific platform that you had used for that.
Yes. Oh, golly Wally. So the platform that I use, it was through my through VCU's library, and I forget the name of it, but it allows you to, if you want, you can search like a lot of newspapers at the national level in order. So, I mean, that can probably be overwhelming. So what I ended up doing was just focusing on the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And I'm so sorry, I forget like the database that I used through the library, but some of the keywords that I used, because slum clearance, that was a term that was used a lot in the old days. So back in the day. So I used that. Unfortunately, I would have to use the keyword Negro because that was a word that was used to describe Black people at the time. So I would often start there, and that would generate like a wealth of articles to go through. Urban renewal was something that started being used, I guess I noticed in the 1950s and 1960s, but slum clearance, I mean, that was the program that was being issued and utilized. So that helped to generate just a lot of leads for my own research.
Thank you. And I just popped in the chat for folks at Ohio State a link to, we have many databases like the ones that you're describing for searching historic newspapers. So I popped that in there for folks who might be interested in taking a look at what we have here. And then the other question, it just says, great job, LaToya. And how about the future of your map app?
I know who asked that question. Hi, Dr. Wynn Bryan. Well, as you know, my map app is a work in progress, but what I envision with it is making it accessible to the public. And I want something that people can add and contribute to, because as I mentioned before, like a lot of my research is stemmed in what community members and the elders like shared with me. So I want to have a platform where people can freely add and update this app as I go along. So yes, but I need to finish it up first and make it so that it's more accessible to the public.
We have another question that just came in asking, have you branched out in your research to include how highway and transportation projects created Black displacement as well?
Yeah, so I must say that I have definitely been more of a housing focused kind of person. That's the what I've been interested in. But I recently have started looking at transportation plans, and I mentioned the one from the 1950s that Ohio State University graciously has digitized. But Oh my word. It was a confidential plan. That's how it was labeled, but it shows just all of these proposed routes. And the planners were from Ohio. And I just thought it was interesting because I guess they were a little bit more objective in their recommendations. And their recommendations actually, if followed, could have saved a lot of Black communities from being displaced. So I am going to be diving into that a little bit more. And then one of my colleagues mentioned that I should look more into records kept by the Virginia Department of Transportation. So those will definitely be my next steps. Transportation hasn't been my focus, but I'm realizing like that's a very critical part that needs to be added to this research. So thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah, and I just want to ask you a question and hopefully not put you on the spot, but you mentioned that you're a fairly recent graduate, and so I'm just curious about what's next for you in terms of what are you hoping to take on as your next continuing this research and other kinds of opportunities that you're looking for.
Yeah, so I love historic preservation. I'm enjoying where I'm interning at the moment, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. It's a great group of people. And so I guess if there are opportunities for me to stay with them, that's what I'll be focusing on. And I think that would also provide the platform for me to seek to just increase the number of landmarks and historic districts that are important to the African American community, like having those registered. And I would certainly start with Randolph. I think that there is a good argument that can be made for a cultural landscape that, while it may not have all of its structures still intact or physically still existing, a case can be made that this is a place of significance that should be registered and regarded as historic. So that's what I'll be working on. And there are other neighborhoods within Richmond that I think need that work as well. So that's what my focus will be on.
I just want to say good luck, and I hope that you're successful in those efforts. I think you're doing some really important work. We have one final question that just came in, and it's, thank you so much, great work. I'm doing similar research in Albuquerque for some historic Black neighborhoods that were displaced. Your timeline seems to center around the mid-1900s. Have you considered going back further in time to the late 1800s, for instance?
Wow, something I have not. I guess I've been so overwhelmed with everything that's happened in the 1900s. I haven't had a chance to do that, but that's a good question, and I'm going to add that or include that on stuff to do, because I think that that's important as well. Like being able to trace communities to Reconstruction, because there was a very vibrant Black community or population during Reconstruction in Richmond that had formed. And I know that there are some awesome people who are doing that work as well. So I don't want to steal their thunder, but I certainly think that that's worth looking into as well.
Well, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Harvey and Jerica and just say, thank you again so much for doing this presentation today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, LaToya. Really, I want to underscore what Josh said. This is really important work. This is a history that most people don't know. And, it's not just history, it's present and it's future. The past determines what's going to happen in the future unless we're intentional about trying to reverse some of these historical, injustices, then they'll just perpetuate. And so I really do think this is important work, and I just really wish you great luck in your not only in this project but in your career, because it seems like you're gonna make an impact, and I really appreciate your talk today. So yes, that's it. We're just about out of time. So I want to remind everyone that we have our next speaker on July 21st. That'll be Robert Vargas, who will talk about the racial and economic foundations of municipal redistricting. And again, cura.osu.edu, sign up for our monthly newsletter, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, and you'll never miss any of these really interesting talks, exciting events that happen here at Cura. at The Ohio State University. And I also want to thank Josh Savardi and OSU Libraries for being a co-sponsor of this event on Race and Place this summer. So thank you, everyone. That's it for today, and we'll see you again in July. Take care.